The silence in the Montana mountains was a liar. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of the sound of wind-scouring ice from stone. A high, thin scream that worked its way under the collar of Jake Riley's coat and settled deep in his bones. The world was nothing but shades of white and gray, a landscape bleached of life and color, stretching into an indifferent horizon. Below him, the canyon fell away into a chasm of shifting snow and shadow. This was the place. The place where the screaming in his head could finally be answered by the screaming of the wind. And then, nothing at all. Jacob Riley was 32 but felt 100. War had carved years from his face, leaving behind hollows beneath his cheekbones and a permanent exhaustion in his pale blue eyes. A week's worth of dark stubble did little to hide the gauntness of his jaw. He wore an old olive-drab army jacket, the fabric softened with wear and heavy with memories he could no longer carry. It wasn't warm enough for the brutal Montana winter. But warmth wasn't the point. The point was the weight, a familiar pressure on his shoulders from a life he was about to leave behind. He had come here for the quiet, the kind of absolute stillness that only a world frozen solid could offer. A final silence. Beside him, almost invisible against the snow, sat Ghost. The German Shepherd was 9 years old, a venerable age for a dog who had spent his best years navigating the dust and chaos of a forgotten war. His coat, once a standard black and tan, had faded with age and genetics into a remarkable palette of silver, white, and pale gray. He was a living specter, a name given to him by a man who now lived only in Jake's memory. Ghost was still, his posture a perfect model of a soldier, at ease but never truly off-duty. His breathing was a steady, warm cloud in the frigid air. He didn't watch the canyon. He watched Jake. He was the last promise Jake had failed to keep. A living link to Sergeant Mark Olson, Ghost's first handler, Jake's best friend. Mark had made him swear, if anything happened, to look after his dog. Jake had looked after him, right to the bitter end. Jake's gloved hand flexed and unflexed. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel much of anything. The grief had burned itself out, leaving behind only ash and a hollow, aching numbness. This wasn't a rash decision. It was a calculated retreat, the final move in a war he had been losing every single day since he came home. He took a slow breath, the air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. One more step. That was all it would take. One more step, and the weight would be gone. He shifted his feet, the packed snow crunching beneath his boots. He leaned forward, just slightly, letting his gaze fall into the abyss. He was ready. Then, a sound cut through the air, sharp and guttural. A growl. Jake didn't move. He thought he'd imagined it, another phantom sound from a mind that wouldn't shut up. But it came again, lower this time. A vibration he could almost feel through the soles of his boots. He glanced down. Ghost was no longer sitting. He was standing, rigid as steel, his head raised and his ears pinned forward. His gaze was locked on something far across the canyon, toward a dense thicket of pine trees on the opposing ridge. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice a rough, unused thing. "There's nothing out there." Ghost ignored him. A sharp, explosive bark ripped from his chest, echoing strangely in the vast emptiness. Then another. It wasn't the sound of a dog chasing a squirrel. It was the frantic, urgent alarm of a K9 who had found something. Something wrong. "Ghost! Quiet!" Jake commanded, his voice sterner now. He wanted this moment to be his. He wanted the silence. But the dog was beyond his command. He took a few stiff steps forward, his body low to the ground, his eyes never leaving that single point in the distance. He barked again, a desperate, almost pleading sound this time. Jake followed the dog's intense stare. Through the blowing snow, he could just make out a dark shape nestled among the pines. An old cabin, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of snow, looking abandoned and half swallowed by the wilderness. There was no light, no smoke from its chimney, no sign of life at all. Still, Ghost persisted, his barks growing more insistent with every passing second. It was a language Jake had been trained to understand, a sound that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. It was the same sound Ghost had made moments before an IED had turned their world to fire and dust. It wasn't a warning of danger to them. It was an alert, an undeniable professional declaration that something out there, in that desolate landscape, demanded their attention. The final step Jake had been about to take was forgotten. The pull of the abyss behind him began to fade, replaced by the pull of his dog's desperate plea. For the first time in months, a question pierced through the fog of his despair, clear and sharp as the winter air. What did he see? For a long moment, Jake remained frozen at the canyon's edge, a statue of indecision. The abyss behind him promised an end to feeling, but the dog in front of him, vibrating with a purpose Jake had forgotten existed, demanded that he feel something more. An old instinct, buried under years of grief and numbness, finally took hold. He turned his back on the fall and gave a short, sharp nod, not to Ghost, but to himself. One last mission. He found a less treacherous game trail and began the descent, his boots sinking deep into the powder with every punishing step, while Ghost moved ahead with an unnerving certainty. The journey was a descent into a white hell. The snow, which had seemed like a quiet blanket from above, was now a treacherous, shifting ocean. It filled his boots, numbed his feet, and pulled at his legs with a dead weight that felt personal. The wind howled through the skeletal pines, and the sound was no longer just wind. It was the high-pitched shriek of incoming artillery over the Korengal Valley. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, but the images flared behind his eyelids anyway. The blinding white of the snow became the searing flash of an explosion. The muffled silence became the deafening ring in his ears right after the blast. He could almost smell the dust and cordite. He stumbled, catching himself on a low-hanging branch, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of a terror he thought he had learned to contain. He looked up to see Ghost waiting for him 20 yards ahead, a pale gray shape against the endless white. The dog wasn't impatient. He just stood there, his steady gaze a silent anchor in Jake's swirling storm of memory. It was that look, the same one Mark used to give him, that quieted the ghosts of the past, enough for him to take another step. He pushed on, his world narrowed to the single-minded task of putting one foot in front of the other, following the one living thing in this wasteland that seemed to know where it was going. When they finally emerged from the trees and stood before the cabin, Jake felt a profound and sinking disappointment. It was exactly as it had appeared from across the canyon, a desolate, forgotten relic. The rough-hewn logs were weathered to a silver gray, and snow had drifted into high banks against the walls, burying the front door halfway. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out into the storm. There was absolutely no sign of life. With a heavy heart, Jake began to circle the structure, his legs burning with the effort of trudging through the deep drifts. The blanket of snow was pristine, an unbroken expanse of white that had clearly not been disturbed for weeks, maybe longer. There were no footprints leading in or out, save for the ones they were making right now. There was no stack of firewood, no wisp of smoke from the stone chimney. Nothing. The last flicker of purpose that had ignited within him was snuffed out, leaving a cold, bitter emptiness in its place. He had been a fool. He had dragged himself through this frozen nightmare, reliving the worst moments of his life, chasing a phantom his dog had conjured from the wind. He turned on Ghost, his voice cracking with a frustration born of absolute despair. "What was it, boy? A rabbit? A ghost like you?" The dog whined softly, pressing his head against Jake's leg, but the gesture offered no comfort. It felt like a lie. The cold he had been fighting off with sheer momentum now flooded his system. The exhaustion was a physical entity, a crushing weight that settled on his shoulders and dragged him down. The journey back across the canyon felt not just daunting, but impossible. He took one step, then another, before his legs gave out from under him. He fell, not with a hard thud, but with a soft, final sigh into a deep snowdrift. The snow was surprisingly gentle, a soft pillow that muffled the screaming wind. It insulated him, embraced him. The thought of just closing his eyes, of letting this quiet white world swallow him whole, was no longer a terrifying prospect. It was a relief. The fight was over. He had tried, and he had failed. He let his head rest back in the cold, soft powder, the last of his strength seeping out of him and into the frozen earth. He let his eyes drift closed. The swirling snow behind his eyelids was less chaotic than the storm in his mind. The cold was a strange comfort now, a final blanket settling over him. It was a quiet way to go. He felt a gentle pressure on his cheek, then a wetness. He weakly brushed it away, annoyed. "Leave me alone! Let me sleep!" The pressure came again, more insistent this time. A firm nudge from a cold, wet nose. Ghost. The dog pushed his head under Jake's arm, whining, a low, anxious sound. Jake didn't have the energy to push him away. He just wanted it all to end. Then the sound changed. It was no longer the anxious whine of a worried pet. It was a sound Jake hadn't heard in years, but one his body recognized before his mind did. It was a short, sharp, breathy exhalation, almost a cough, followed by a low, contented rumble. It was a sound that had been meticulously trained into the dog through thousands of hours of repetition. It was not a bark of alarm. It was a signal of success. It was the sound Ghost was taught to make when he had located his target and was waiting for his handler to act. It was the K9 equivalent of the words, "Objective found." That single, quiet sound cut through the fog of Jake's surrender like a flare in the night. It was a signal that demanded a response, a command woven into the very fiber of his being. The broken man lying in the snowdrift wanted to ignore it, wanted to embrace the encroaching darkness. But the soldier inside him, long dormant, sat up and took notice. With a groan that was equal parts physical pain and mental anguish, he pushed himself up onto one elbow. The world spun for a moment, a nauseating swirl of white. He looked at Ghost. The dog had backed away slightly and sat with perfect posture, his tail giving a single, steady thump against the snow. His ears were relaxed, his gaze fixed on the cabin, calm and certain. He had done his job. Now he was waiting for Jake to do his. A new strength, born not of hope but of pure, conditioned duty, flooded Jake's limbs. He got to his feet, swaying, every muscle screaming in protest. The exhaustion was a physical enemy he now had to fight. He staggered back toward the cabin, his boots feeling like they were filled with lead. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to respond to the dog's signal. He reached the cabin and leaned his full weight against the rough, frozen logs, his chest heaving. He shut his eyes, not in defeat this time, but in intense concentration. He forced himself to block out everything else. The roar of the wind, the creak of the snow-laden pines, the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. He listened. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the storm. The wind howled, a mocking voice that whispered of his foolishness. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to prick at him. He was losing his mind. He was chasing sounds that weren't there, inventing missions to delay the inevitable. He was about to turn away, to finally succumb to the freezing despair. When it happened, the wind dropped. For 3, maybe 4, perfect seconds, an almost supernatural silence fell over the landscape. And in that silence, he heard it. It was so faint he almost missed it. A delicate thread of sound woven into the quiet. It was a simple tune, a melody a mother would hum to her child. It was a lullaby. The thin, wavering sound was unmistakably human, and it was punctuated by a tiny, hitching sob. It was the sound of a child trying to comfort herself in the dark. The sound struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. Adrenaline, pure and cold, surged through him, burning away every last trace of his self-pity and numbness. It was real. Ghost had been right. The cabin was no longer an abandoned relic. It was a location. The snow was no longer a tomb. It was an obstacle. The world, which had been a blurry, meaningless mess, snapped into sharp, tactical focus. The soldier was back in command. His heart, which had been faltering, now beat with a strong, steady rhythm, a cadence he knew well. There was a mission, and a life depended on it. There was no time for doubt. The soldier in Jake assessed the situation with a clarity that had been absent for years. The cabin was a hostile location. The child was a non-combatant in need of extraction. He was the sole asset on the ground. His first priority was intelligence and backup. With no cell service in the remote mountains, that meant going back to town. He gave Ghost a quiet command, a simple hand signal, and they turned their backs on the cabin, moving with a newfound urgency. The journey back was different. The biting wind was no longer a personal torment, but an environmental factor to be overcome. The deep snow was not a grave, but a tactical obstacle. He was no longer a man fading into the white, but a soldier moving through it, his canine partner at his side. The town, a cluster of a dozen buildings huddled in a valley, was nearly deserted. Its residents hunkered down against the worsening weather. The only sign of life came from a single building with a faded sign that read, "The Rusty Pick," its windows glowing with a warm yellow light. Jake pushed the door open, bringing a swirl of snow in with him. The handful of patrons at the bar turned to look, their conversations faltering. The man behind the bar, a portly man in his 60s with a weary face and a thick gray mustache, wiped the counter with a rag. His name was Earl, and his tired eyes had seen generations of this town's quiet struggles. He knew Jake as the silent veteran who bought supplies and never said more than 2 words. Jake's appearance, wild-eyed and breathing hard, his jacket caked in snow, was alarming. He bypassed the bar and went straight to Earl. "I need the sheriff," Jake said, his voice raw. "The phone lines are down. Storm's getting worse." Earl's gaze sharpened. "What's the trouble, son?" "There's a child," Jake said, keeping his voice low. "A little girl. In the old Miller cabin up on the ridge." Earl's face went pale. He leaned closer. "A little girl? Was she wearing a pink coat?" Jake's sharp nod was all the confirmation he needed. "My God, that's Lily Patterson. Went missing 2 days ago. The whole county's been looking for her." His eyes flicked nervously toward the door. "Her folks are worried sick. Said she wandered off. We all figured, with this weather." He trailed off. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a fella, new to town. Guy named Rick. Been staying at the old motel. Running from some bad debts back east. Sheriff had a word with him yesterday. He was seen heading up toward the woods that same afternoon." The pieces clicked into place. No time to wait. "The sheriff," Jake repeated. "Where is he?" "She," Earl corrected. "Sheriff Miller. She's out checking on the folks up on the North Road. No telling when she'll be back." That was it. There would be no backup. As if on cue, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the saloon. The storm was here. Jake turned and left without another word, Ghost at his heels. He raced back towards the ridge. The blizzard now, a raging white wall of fury. Visibility was down to a few feet. As he neared the cabin, a figure emerged from the doorway. A thin man with shifty eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. Rick. He was cursing at the sky, trapped by the very storm that was Jake's cover. Jake stepped out from the trees. "Let the girl go, Rick." Rick spun around, his face a mask of panic and rage. "I don't know what you're talking about." He backed toward the cabin door, his hand fumbling inside his coat. He pulled out a hunting knife, its blade long and ugly. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged. The fight exploded in the cramped, squalid space of the single-room cabin. In the corner, a small girl in a filthy pink coat watched with wide, terrified eyes. Lily. Rick was wiry and desperate, swinging the knife wildly. Jake parried a blow, the blade slicing through the sleeve of his jacket. As Rick lunged again, a gray and white blur shot past Jake. Ghost, silent and lethal, clamped his powerful jaws around Rick's knife arm. The man screamed, a sound of agony and shock, and the knife clattered to the floor. The distraction was all Jake needed. He drove his shoulder into Rick's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Just as Jake subdued him, a new sound cut through the howl of the storm, the high-pitched whine of a snowmobile engine. The cabin door burst open, splintering from its hinges. A woman in a thick sheriff's jacket stood silhouetted against the blizzard, her weapon drawn. She was in her 40s, with a sturdy build and a no-nonsense expression that took in the entire scene in a second. Jake, pinning a groaning man to the floor, the terrified child in the corner, and the magnificent dog standing guard over them all. A low growl still rumbling in his chest. Justice had arrived. Sheriff Miller's presence filled the small cabin with an authority that calmed the chaos. Her gaze swept over the scene, landing on Jake with a look of sharp understanding. She saw not a vigilante, but a soldier who had completed a desperate duty. She gave him a single, sharp nod of respect before her focus softened and shifted entirely to the small figure in the corner. Lily was still huddled there, a silent statue in a soiled pink coat, her eyes wide with a terror that had not yet faded. Jake pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached her not as a rescuer, but as one might approach a frightened fawn, making himself small, keeping his hands visible. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's okay now. You're safe." Ghost, sensing the delicacy of the moment, remained by the door, a quiet, reassuring anchor. Jake knelt, and after a long moment, Lily looked from his face to the steady presence of the dog and back again. She took a hesitant step forward. With infinite gentleness, Jake scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he could have imagined, a fragile bundle of bones and fear. He wrapped his own large army jacket around her, covering the dirty pink one, and she didn't fight him. For the first time, she clung to something. The journey out of the cabin was a slow, deliberate procession. Sheriff Miller led the way, her flashlight cutting a path through the raging blizzard. Jake followed, his steps sure and steady now, his precious cargo held tight against his chest. Ghost walked faithfully beside them, his gray-white form a guardian leading them out of the heart of the storm. Back in town, waiting at the sheriff's station, were Lily's parents. The moment they saw their daughter, alive, carried in the arms of a stranger, the air filled with a sound of raw, uncontainable relief. Jake gently handed the small girl to her sobbing mother, a quiet transfer of responsibility. As the family enveloped their lost child, Jake and Ghost stepped back into the shadows of the storm. Their mission complete. The winter that had tried to claim him finally broke its hold on the mountains. The thaw came slowly at first, then all at once, in a rush of melting snow and the smell of damp earth. The skeletal trees grew green buds, and the silence of the snow was replaced by the cheerful chaos of birdsong. Months later, Jake stood at the edge of the same canyon. The sun was warm on his face, and a gentle breeze stirred the new grass at his feet. He was standing in the exact spot where he had come to die. But now, he had never felt more alive. The chasm below was no longer an abyss of despair, but a place of breathtaking beauty, carved by time and endurance. He looked down at Ghost, who was lying in a patch of sunlight, his old bones soaking in the warmth. The dog's muzzle was whiter now, his movements stiffer, but his eyes were clear and content. In saving Lily, Jake knew Ghost had also saved him. He had given him back the one thing he thought was lost forever: a mission. The screaming in his head had faded, replaced by a quiet, steady purpose. He couldn't be the only one. There were other soldiers, lost in their own winters, who needed a reason to keep fighting. He knew then what he had to do. He would start a program, a small non-profit that rescued dogs from shelters and trained them to become partners for veterans struggling with the ghosts of war. Ghost would be his first instructor. In a small meadow below the ridge, where wildflowers now bloomed, Jake dug a small hole in the rich soil. Lily, her laughter now as easy and bright as the spring sun, carefully placed a tiny sapling into the earth. She was no longer the silent, haunted child from the cabin. She was just a little girl, full of light. She patted the dirt around the young tree's base with her small hands. Jake helped her, his large, scarred hands working alongside hers. Ghost sat watching them, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the ground, a faithful sentinel guarding this small, perfect moment of peace. They were a strange little family, forged in a storm, now planting roots in the sun. For the first time in years, Jake looked toward the future and saw not an empty void, but the promise of something new, something growing. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on a field of fire, but in the silent, frozen landscapes of the heart. And sometimes salvation arrives on four paws, with a loyalty that refuses to let you go. A soldier, a child, and a dog taught us that hope is not just a feeling, but a mission. It's a choice to walk back into the storm, not for yourself, but for the faint whisper of someone who needs to be found. If you believe that one act of courage can thaw the coldest winter, share this story. Let us know in the comments about the loyal companions who have saved you. And subscribe for more stories where hope never gives up.